Reddy to provide his perspective on where he sees all this going.
Good morning. I do not have any PowerPoint to pulverize you with. This particular talk has been assigned to me by Anurag, and I was quite surprised at the challenge that he threw at me when he said, you have to discuss between dystopia and utopia of scientific advances and how the scientific community itself can play a constructive role in ensuring that the road to perdition does not lead to dystopia, but the road to progress will lead to a utopia. Now, that's a very tough challenge to undertake, particularly after the excellent talks that have been given. Let me therefore declare at the very outset that I am a science enthusiast and I am not a technology cynic. Nevertheless, one has to ponder somewhat carefully about the road that lies ahead and how best the scientific community itself can manage the progress of science and technology in a manner that best benefits human progress. Now let me start with a story of a person, a real person, who some of you in the audience may be familiar with, but not all. Thomas Midgley, who died in 1944 at the age of 55. He was an American inventor who became famous for two inventions: leaded gasoline and chlorofluorocarbons. Now, he was given many awards and became the president and chairman of the American Chemical Society in 1944, a few months before he died. But both his inventions were later banned, but not before they did great damage to humanity. Leaded gasoline, that is filling petrol with lead, essentially he found that addition of tetraethyl lead to petrol prevented knocking of the internal combustion engine, and that was lapped up by the automobile industry. Then he also invented chlorofluorocarbons for introduction in refrigerators as a non-poisonous substance, which actually he felt helped the release of many of the gaseous substances which were required, and these were used in refrigerators, aerosols, various sprays and inhalers. But again, these were found to be actually creating huge holes in the ozone layer, and that was again detrimental very much to human health and to the environment. And of course, leaded petrol was extremely dangerous in terms of lead poisoning and in terms of the effects on cognitive function and the variety of effects of lead on human health. Now, environmentalists may feel that Thomas Midgley has earned a special place in hell, but he was blameless, because when he actually invented them, he did not realize that these could be the adverse consequences. He did it in the best belief that this was for the good of humanity. And indeed, even some of the things that we celebrate today, and which actually are leading us to the utopia of genetic engineering and the products thereof, were also not envisaged essentially to lead exactly in the same direction. When scientists started studying bacteria infected by viruses and how they behaved in a peculiar manner, little did they imagine that they would discover restriction enzymes which cut DNA at specific sites and which are now fundamental to genetic engineering. So, as the French poet Valéry says, we enter the future backwards. We cannot always see what lies ahead, entirely some decades ahead. So we have to be careful about the manner in which some of the intended, but also many of the unintended consequences of what we are producing today can be mapped, and where they are potentially detrimental, whether they can be actually corrected, and where does the responsibility of science and the scientific community lie there. Switch fast forward to the present time. Very recently, the inventor of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee, he has warned of digital dystopia if the world fails to tackle threats such as disinformation and invasion of privacy. In his plea for a contract for the web, he says, quote, "If we fail to defend the free and open web, we risk a digital dystopia of entrenched inequality and abuse of rights," unquote. Now, we have been talking about algorithms, and certainly algorithms are important, and they can certainly help us in decision making, and certainly they can liberate both the physician and the patient in terms of medical care, and help much better decision making in certain periods of uncertainty. However, as has been pointed out in the previous talk, we are dealing here not with absolute certainty, but with uncertainty and probabilities, which are actually based on Bayesian principles. Bayesian principles of prediction, which not only look at the likelihood ratio derived from the particular assessment or the test, but from the pre-test probability in that population. And then from that you derive the post-test probability in the individual concerned, whether a person has a disease or no disease. And therefore, the context becomes supremely important because that sets the pre-test probability. Otherwise, you can land up with any amount of false positives. Just to give you an example, the predictive accuracy in terms of actual likelihood of a person having coronary artery disease based on a positive exercise ECG would vary markedly if the patient were a 30-year-old woman with an anemia having a positive exercise test, or a 60-year-old diabetic smoker having a positive exercise test. And therefore the context becomes absolutely important, and this is where sometimes we have a problem with artificial intelligence developing algorithms in the West based on information in a different context and being fast forwarded to commercial processes for application elsewhere in the world in the context of different populations with different population characteristics, different pretest probabilities. And therefore, that is the problem. The answer is not to reject artificial intelligence, but to say that we need to develop some of these algorithms ourselves in our own population, and we need to keep testing them based on changing context. Indeed, Cathy O'Neill, a data scientist, says, quote, "Algorithms are not inherently fair because the person who builds the model defines the success. And therefore, we have to define our own success by building our own algorithms based on our own population experience. And that's where I hope the scientific community will take a lead. But then, instead of being cynical, let us look at what science has to offer. Science has a great power of self-correction. Even the leaded petrol and chlorofluorocarbons example that I gave, it was science which discovered the harmful effects on biology and human health, and therefore that ultimately led to the cry for correction. Though it took several decades, even now you find chlorofluorocarbons, even despite bans, still being used in some of the aerosols. You still find leaded petrol being used in some countries, but it took several decades for that to be corrected. Therefore, science has the power of self-correction by investigating itself, but it certainly needs additional support in order to ensure that the harm caused is greatly limited in scope and time. Now, the problem, of course, is that when science sets out to do so, it must ensure that the scientific temper prevails and not be beset by absolute certitude that we are always right, but retain a certain degree of scientific skepticism. Like Louis Pasteur told his research fellows, young research fellows, keep your enthusiasm, but let strict verification be its constant companion. But we do have, unfortunately, the fallacy of falling into that certitude. For example, William Stewart, the Surgeon General of the United States in 1968-69, went and told the US Congress, now we can close the book on infectious diseases. We have done. We have eliminated infectious diseases. That's the end of the chapter. And now, just to teach him a lesson in humanity, the AIDS epidemic broke out soon afterwards, and now we are seeing a spate of zoonotic diseases. Certainly, this world is not free of infectious diseases, unlikely to be so for quite some time to come. Similarly, even the current director of NIH, Francis Collins, when he unveiled the human genome, told the world, now we have enough information that we can prevent every disease. Now, we know that's not true. We know now that genetic profiling, particularly in several chronic diseases, explains only a small amount of variance. These are polygenic, but most importantly, they're also gene expression is conditioned by environmental factors, what we now call epigenetics, and a multitude of environmental factors. So now NIH is putting a huge amount of money into epigenetic factors. Yes, there is self-correction, but after a certain amount of certitude, which led us to believe that we have absolutely got all the answers. So that is where I believe a certain amount of humility and skepticism is important for the scientific community itself, if it has to play a role in self-correction. But then we are also now seeing it's not just science that is dictating the course. The whole area of economic interests. Now, economic interests can actually act in two ways. They can firstly assert science and the products of science and track them fast forward in directions that science probably never intended. Or it can counter the product of science, including the learnings of science, through fake news and alternate facts when it does not suit their convenience. So how do we actually fit in this additional element which is overpowering what the value of science is to society? Therefore, how much can you rely on the strength of science alone to resist some of these forces? In terms of the process of commercialization, now actually we have entered a different phase. Unlike 50 years ago, now we have entered a phase of very rapid commercialization and scale-up. We are on the super speed treadmill of technology commercialization. And we find that political interests also either benefit and collude with some of these economic interests. Therefore, science alone will be unable to combat all of the unintended ill effects of scientific discovery and technology development. And even science can be co-opted or seduced by economic interests. And that is where we have to be fairly wary of. Like, for example, when Walden Law came up with a polypill of 6 medicines saying that if these are taken, people with cardiovascular risk will actually will be greatly protected from developing a heart attack for primary prevention, not just for secondary prevention. But then they said, everybody above the age of 55 in the world must take it, because everybody has some risk factors. What they did not reveal, that Walden Law had a patent which they commercialized. So even science can be seduced by economic interests. So we certainly have this particular problem when molecular biology has transitioned to biotechnology, and where we find that research institutions and universities are not only opening the gate to commercialization of technology products, but are actually becoming the corridors of economic interest. And that is where we have to be very careful as to how we actually steer science in the right direction and not necessarily fall prey to some of the distortions introduced by purely commercial considerations. And we also have to be very careful about the overreach of science. Like, for example, look at the Chinese scientist, He Jiankui, who broke regulations to create the world's first gene-edited babies at Shenzhen in China. He edited the CCR5 gene of embryos to give them resistance to HIV. In his mind, he was protecting humanity by creating by doing genetic engineering on fetuses so that they could be protected from HIV. But by releasing the whole area of genetic engineering and genetically engineered babies, he created the whole aura of the Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster, and has been now expelled from the university and disowned by the scientific community, because the unintended consequences of these can be terrible, as we found out from eugenics. And again, we have to go back to history as to where what appears to be exciting science can be tremendously detrimental. In 1883, Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, coined the term eugenics from the Greek word good birth or noble inheritability. And later on, even eminent scientists like Huxley and Haldane thought that this is going to be helpful in creating better human beings, improving the human race not from the point of view of racial purity, but in terms of better health, better intellectual prowess, and so on. But then we started looking at what the unintended consequences were. The Nazi government under Hitler in 1933, the Hitler's cabinet, promulgated the eugenics sterilization law. People who were considered mentally feeble, and a number of others who were considered inferior races, were forcibly sterilized, and then that again opened the ways for genocide. So we have also seen this being institutionalized as racism, because saying that certain races are inferior, and therefore eugenics should be applied to ensure racial superiority. And even distinguished statisticians like Carl Pearson and a Nobel laureate like James Watson became racist because of some of these beliefs. So we have to be very careful as to what we are unleashing while we try and preserve the benefits of new technological innovations. And now, when science progresses to technology and gets rapidly scaled up, there can be a public and societal benefit as intended by the discoverer. There can also be commercial profit, no harm in that. But when the commercial profit dominates, then who can put the brakes or redirect? That is the big question. Will it be a regulator, a government regulator, or scientist himself or herself as a controlling factor, trying to bring good scientific understanding to say, thus far and no further, not this direction, you have to change your direction? Or is it the public represented by a broader group of representatives? Now, let me go back again to another example in history, not necessarily from biology. Leo Szilard, a Hungarian scientist who later went to the United States, first conceived of a chain reaction that could trigger an atomic bomb. And he contributed very actively to the process that led. He made Einstein write a letter to the US President Roosevelt saying that we must try and look at how the atomic energy could be harnessed for the benefit of the war. But later on, as the war entered the final stages, he realized the implications. He knew that Allies were going to win anyway, but he didn't want the bomb to be actually used, tested, and used. He later organized a petition to President Harry Truman, who had succeeded Roosevelt by that time, advocating against the use of the bomb. 67 scientists signed the letter, but Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, refused. And the reason he refused is this, quote, Teller wrote to Szilard, quote, "First of all, let me say that I have no hope of clearing my conscience. The things we are working on are so terrible that no amount of protesting or fiddling with politics will save our souls. Our only hope is in getting the facts of our results before the people." So he said, let us share this information with the people and maybe the people will prevent the horror of an atomic war. Now, that did not happen, but they could not go to the people. Harry Truman did not bother to read the letter. So anyway, all these issues happened. But the question was, where does the safeguard lie? Now, let me quote another American another statesman, Thomas Jefferson, quote, "I know no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society, but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened," because many say, what do people understand? They're lay people, they don't understand science, they don't understand technology. "If we think them not enlightened enough to exercise that control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion. Engage with them, educate with them, give them the information, so ultimately they will also act as custodians of public interest. So assisting people, society as a collective whole, or the individual patient who is being empowered, so that it is the patient who talks to the physician and says, I will see you now. How do we make the right decision? Letting the public collective or the individual patient make the right decision is also a duty of the scientific community. But the question is, how well are we doing it? How are we empowering the patient? How are we creating an enlightened community? That attempt will be made in earnest only when we realize that science is not the sole legitimate arbiter of all relevant truth, nor of public interest. Yet it can protect public interest better than pure commercial drivers advancing the application of technologies. Therefore, we have to now really look at how best we can play that role. Now, let me give you how it works in public health, or it should work in public health. In terms of making public policy, Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany in the 19th century, said, there are two things that should not be watched while they're being made: sausages and public policy. Both unedifying spectacles. But nevertheless, an American policy requires scientific credibility, financial feasibility, operational steerability, and political viability. That it means it requires basic science research, clinical research, epidemiological research, health systems research, health economics research, and social science research. And when we bring all of these together, then we can actually create the crucible for creating and driving healthy policy. And therefore, here, it is important that the scientific community as a whole, and not in pieces, and civil society and the media collectively act as watchdogs, so that we actually move the products of science towards a utopia and not towards a dystopia. So, each one of these, however, has chinks in the armor. Now, we are individually fallible as scientists, as investors, as policymakers, as public. But collectively we can be strong. The scientist can suffer the pride of discovery and development, and ego can become an overriding problem. Commercial interest can further corrode the objectivity of even of the scientist. The investor in technology wanting fast and high returns can also sort of steer the ship in the wrong direction. And societal harm and cautionary conduct are far from the mind of those who are actually trying to satisfy the venture capitalist and the shareholder. For the policymaker who is unfamiliar with science and technology, either he can be swept by arbitrary claims of the potential, swept by the hype, or even lured by the money, and the public is unaware and does not engage. All these are weaknesses. But collectively, if we can actually ensure that each one of them can become a relatively responsible player, engaging not only on their own but together, then we can actually ensure that the products of science and technology can move towards a utopia and not towards a dystopia. Because there are elements in each of these which can combine for public good. Therefore, we need to build those kind of coalitions. So ultimately, for example, let's look at it. Dr. Khan spoke about the value of vaccines. Why is it that in India today, we are unable to introduce the HPV vaccine for cervical cancer, which is one of the leading cancers of women in India? Because some of the demonstration projects were accused of unethical conduct. But for that reason, do we deny our women the benefits of HPV vaccine, which is advocated by WHO, which most other countries have adopted? It is because we have not engaged with the political community or the public at large about what is the truth about the vaccine, what is the potential benefit, what are the perils of not utilizing appropriate technologies. Therefore, the scientific community has stepped forward and engaged. Even in the area of vaccine refusals, even otherwise, where measles is making an appearance, you cannot cede ground to to people who are spreading false news. And that is where the scientific community has to engage. I believe, ultimately in closure, that a conscientious scientist and a conscious citizen provide the best defense against a dystopian society. But are we really building that bridge of open communication? I think there is a lot that needs to be done in that area. Thank you.